Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this instalment things go bump in the night as Andy Nyman, Alex Lawther, Paul Whitehouse and Martin Freeman star in the adaptation of the hit stage play Ghost Stories. Professor Goodman, played by Andy Nyman, has made his name debunking fraudulent psychics and the supernatural, inspired by his idol Charles Cameron, who mysteriously disappeared. Goodman receives a message from Cameron, very much alive, who assigns him 3 cases that Cameron could not explain. Paul Whitehouse's Tony Matthews, Alex Lawther's Simon Rifkind, and Martin Freeman's Mike Priddle, to make the skeptical Goodman confront the knowledge that the supernatural is very real. Ghost Stories is based off the Olivier Award-winning West End play of the same name, created by Jeremy Dyson and Andy Nyman, that was a huge hit. It ran for years and played to over 500,000 people and has been performed all across the world. That's quite an accomplishment considering the play started out from the fact that both Nyman and Dyson were both big fans of the horror genre, and Nyman in particular actually had a background in live performance and magic. Not only is Nyman a gifted actor and writer in his own right, but he's also a magician and mentalist, and even collaborated with illusionist Darren Brown on several of his shows and helped write them. So you can understand how those things would have influenced Ghost Stories on the stage and the way it would have been performed in front of a live audience. I can't vouch for that personally, however, because I never saw Ghost Stories in performance. I'm just going to have to settle for the film version, which both Dyson and Nyman have returned for, which is understandable given the success they've had on the stage, but the challenge is trying to transfer that onto screen. Many stage-to-screen adaptations have been caught out by the fact that doing something on the stage is very different to doing it on film. And in the case of Ghost Stories, I think they made a very valiant effort, if not an entirely successful one. The biggest difference between Ghost Stories on stage versus Ghost Stories on film largely comes down to the framing device. In its original theatrical incarnation, Ghost Stories was delivered as a lecture to the audience that was broken up by the 3 extended flashbacks. Obviously on film you can't do that, so they've completely rewritten the backstory, and so this new narrative, it still focuses on the Professor, played by Andy Nyman himself, but what we have now is that he idolises a fellow skeptic who presents him with the 3 cases, and he has to go out and see each and every one of them, and in that way they've opened it up slightly, they've made it a bit more cinematic, but generally speaking, the play is still very much intact here. The general core of it is that it's an anthology, and in many ways it's quite an old-fashioned one. They're big fans of Amicus and Hammer, and you can definitely see that influence here. I'm saying that because I think that some people might want to temper their expectations. Locally, this has been blazoned with the scariest British horror film in years, which perhaps gives people different expectations than they really should do, because in terms of the horror genre, in the past decade, I think it's found its bite again. I think that the horror movies that are coming out at the moment, especially in the mainstream, are some of the best they've been in a very long time, and there's real invention and satire going on in them. There's very distinct commentary in the genre framework. And generally, horror films these days are extremely intense experiences. They try to keep you on the edge of your seat for the entire length of the running time. And if you come into Ghost Stories expecting that, you might come away a little bit disappointed. There is horror here, but it's tempered a lot by dark comedy. There is a very thick vein of dark comedy running all the way through Ghost Stories. But even so, I think that the core stories that it tells, I think each of those individual sequences are told quite well, and they do establish a very good atmosphere. And so we have these 3 stories. We have a night watchman who's looking after an old psychiatric institute. We have a very jittery teenager who's taking his car out on a ride that he really shouldn't do in the middle of the woods. And we have this businessman who is trying to have a baby with his wife, and all 3 of those tales I think are very well directed. And in terms of the individual episodes, I think they're very good at establishing a mood, But I think the biggest problem with Ghost Stories as a film is that in some ways it doesn't feel like it's been altered enough from its theatrical incarnation. This is especially true for the first, in particular, the one about the Night Watchman played by Paul Whitehouse. Paul Whitehouse in this movie is a real revelation to me, it has to be said. Paul Whitehouse is known for his comic background. He's worked with Harry Enfield, he's best known for his work on sketch show The Fast Show. This is a completely different mode here, and Whitehouse, in a relatively straight role, he's very, very convincing, and I was really impressed by him, especially in his scene with Goodman where he's quite evasive and he's very quick to jump down his throat should the wrong question be asked. And that scene alone is really fantastic, even before his flashback segment occurs. The problem with his story is that a lot of it simply comes down to the fact that he's walking around in this dark, abandoned environment with a flashlight, and you're waiting for it to come to a big punchline. You're waiting for things to escalate further, and it never quite does that. It's basically 10 minutes of Paul Whitehouse walking around this deserted place, waiting for things to happen. And while it does build tension, it never hits a high point, I don't think. Not at least until its very final moments, and then it suddenly snaps out of it very quickly. This becomes a recurring pattern all throughout, and I think that some of that has to do with the fact that the play was originally meant for a live environment. So when Paul Whitehouse's Night Watchman is wandering around on stage, you would be in that same environment yourself. Everything would be dark, and you wouldn't be able to see what was going on, so you'd be able to be surprised in that way. And so the immediacy of it is removed by the film translation, which is a problem that they obviously were going to face. You could never quite replicate that live experience on something that has obviously been recorded and edited. And I think that there is something missing. Even in the second instalment, it again faces the same problem. Alex Lawther is really good in this movie. He definitely gets the most comedic element of the movie. Dyson actually comes from a fairly comedic background himself. He wrote episodes of The League of Gentlemen. You can certainly see that influence in this middle one, which is definitely the oddest of the three stories in its own way, and definitely the one that plays it mostly for laughs. And so there is very much in this particular instalment a juggling between those two different tones, which I think it manages to accomplish. And again, a lot of it comes down to this dark, abandoned setting that you could replicate on stage fairly easily. It again suffers the same problem where it reaches what should be its peak and then it very abruptly stops. It just doesn't feel like there's actual resolution going on to either of these two stories, which is intentional because there is an overarching narrative you're expecting them to pay off in a larger fashion. But even as individual episodes, I was expecting them to have a little more closure than they really do. And the third one is definitely the one that I would say is the scariest. That's Martin Freeman's Businessman. If you're noticing that I'm being very evasive in the way that I'm talking about all these stories, it's because Ghost Stories is very easy to spoil in its own way. Ghost Stories on the stage was actually notable for the fact that its publicity was quite minimalist, in that the publicity didn't show you anything about the play. All you had was photos of people looking scared and frightened, and that was pretty much the hook. You didn't need anything more than that, and they were very much encouraging audiences to prevent spoilers from coming out, not telling people the secrets of it. And there are plenty of secrets in the film version as well. And so it's somewhat difficult to review this without tripping on the minefield of revealing maybe a little bit too much about what's going on. So while we have these little episodes, as it were, the overarching narrative always comes back around to the Professor. He's our main protagonist, especially in this film incarnation where we've given him this whole backstory, whereas in the play he was more of a narrational figure. And I think that the problem with the film, at least for me, to a certain extent, comes down to the fact that the Professor, despite Andy Nyman's best efforts, is easily the least compelling figure out of the four main characters. And so any time the movie has to cut back to him, it does feel like it's deflating somewhat, and it feels very stop-start in its structure. It never builds up a momentum, at least in my experience. It always feels like there's long lulls between the scary moments, and it never quite sustains its atmosphere. And on a character point of view, because the film is meant to be focused on him, and that becomes increasingly clear, that poses something of a struggle for the film in the fact that such large chunks of it are without him. The focus moves away from him for such long periods of time. These individual flashbacks are about 10 minutes each, so that's a good 35, 40 minutes, at least half the running time, where he's simply not around as a main focal point. Although I will give Nyman and Dyson credit, they have planted clues to what's going on and what links all these characters together and how they link with the Professor. There are genuine hints scattered all throughout the movie, and the film wants you to pick up on them. It invites you to play detective alongside the Professor. In fact, it very much wants you to do that by its very structure, where we're going from case to case and it looks at them in a fairly objective manner. And so that's actually quite clever. There is definitely things that you're meant to pick up, like these very deliberate recurring motifs and elements. However, I do think that maybe it's a little too good at it, because I do have to admit that I think the film kind of tips its hand a little bit too early, it has to be said. I think I was maybe too attuned to picking up these cues. I think that very much depends on the audience member, though. And while there's definitely fun in trying to solve the mystery, the puzzle at the centre of it, at the same time, what really frustrated me about ghost stories, especially in retrospect, looking back over the movie, is that it introduces a lot of things that it simply doesn't do anything with. There are certainly things that are established in the film that look like they're going to be important, and then nothing. And they're not even red herrings. They're just simply loose threads. Like at the very beginning of the movie, we get this backstory about the Professor and his bar mitzvah and how there was a big family falling out. And you think that's going to come into play, especially because the flashbacks in the movie, they all have these recurring themes of guilt and family. And Goodman is repeatedly chastised about the fact that he doesn't have anyone but himself. He's very much devoted himself to his work rather than raising a family, whereas that stands in stark contrast to the figures that he's investigating, in that the Night Watchman has a daughter that's being hospitalised, the businessman is trying to start a family, and of course the teenager, he's part of a very overbearing family. And so each of those themes comes back into play, and you'd expect that to tie in with the Professor. And it also makes a big deal about Goodman's Jewish background. There is definitely recurring elements of the fact that he's bullied because of his religion, and you wonder if that's going to come into play, where belief in that kind of way, in sort of a spiritual faith kind of way, is going to play a major part in the movie. And the film, again, doesn't really do anything with that, and I found that hugely disappointing, especially because it essentially distracts from what's really going on in the movie. And I don't think that's entirely deliberate. I just think those are ideas that it doesn't want to explore, and that's I just wonder why they're there in the first place if that's the case. However, as the movie goes into its final third, I think it's then that it really starts to kick up a notch and shows the sheer extent of its invention and toying with both the audience and the medium of cinema. Things get very weird very quickly, and they embrace these kind of surreal, twisted ideas that are also very funny. It's a really kind of heady mixture of both humour and horror that I wish the earlier section of the film had perhaps juggled a bit more overtly. They were a bit more bolder and more experimental with it, because this shows what they could have done. And it feels somewhat like a missed opportunity to do that in the earlier sections of the movie, or at least hint a little bit more towards it. I think that the earlier sections of the movie suffer from maybe staying a bit too close to theatricality, whereas this last part very much is improved by straying away from that and doing things that are a bit more difficult to do on the stage. And I think that that portion of the movie shows so much more energy than the rest of it, and it seems like the movie's very much coming to a head at that point onward. It's got this very, very long build-up, and then it reaches a peak and abruptly reaches its ending yet again. It's this recurring problem where it builds up and builds up and builds up and then doesn't satisfactorily pay off, and this is especially the case with the ending. The ending is hugely frustrating in a number of ways that obviously I can't reveal, but I think the biggest problem with it is that it negates a lot of the mystery, and I think it makes the movie feel very, very small and very, very minor in the ultimate revelation of what's actually going on. I think that that's enormously annoying, because the movie had been doing so well and it had done things in such a intelligent way, and then it does something that I think is a bit hokey and doesn't really satisfy the audience. I would still recommend Ghost Stories to horror fans. It's very much a love letter to the genre. There are deliberate homages that its fans will pick up on. This is very much old school scares, and it does that fairly effectively. It's not really like a lot of how the genre is these days, in that it's either extreme gore or prolonged tension, although it does have a concession to modern audiences in that there is a lot of jump scares here, which are effectively used, but they are fairly frequent in this movie, and sometimes it does feel like a substitute for actual scares and actual terror sometimes. But even so, I think that the movie does have plenty to recommend it. I think it's very much a movie that you would watch on a dark night to creep you out. I think the biggest problem, though, is that ending. That ending is such a big issue, but I think even that can be resolved by maybe keeping your expectations in check. I think to some extent it's a victim of its own overhype. Don't go into this movie expecting the greatest horror movie to come out in recent years, because honestly, Ghost Stories isn't. In fact, there are better horror films playing right now, but taken on its own merits, I think this is an effective little scare machine. Ghost Stories is a throwback to classic anthology horror that provides some clever old school scares, but does lose something in the translation to film. As far as the individual flashbacks, they build a good atmosphere and have a rich streak of humour running through them, especially in Lawther's segment, but they do feel like they could have been expanded further and all come to abrupt conclusions just as they start to hit their peak, missing the immediacy of their live versions. The film is exceptionally well acted and directed, with Paul Whitehouse and Martin Freeman being the standouts especially, but the framing storyline that ties these tales together is ultimately disappointing. As the film reaches its final stages, there's a joy in seeing it go all out, but it quickly makes its way to an ending that, while teased, abandons a lot of interesting ideas in the process. It's a shame the film closes on that note, as it makes Ghost Stories feel slight, especially in retrospect. If you like this review, then you can haunt my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, but until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.